At 2:15 in the morning, the city no longer looked like it did during the day. The glass tower on Jefferson Avenue stood quiet and indifferent, its lights dimmed floor by floor, as if the building itself were sleeping. Inside, the echo of footsteps was replaced by the soft hum of ventilation and the rhythmic squeak of rubber wheels rolling across polished marble. Ethan Walker pushed his janitor cart slowly through the lobby. He had learned long ago not to rush. The night shift rewarded patience, not speed. Every motion he made was deliberate, practiced, almost meditative, wringing the mop, guiding it in smooth arcs across the floor, watching the reflections of ceiling lights stretch and blur beneath the water. For most people, this was just a building. For Ethan, it was a second home. He had worked here for 3 years, 5 nights a week, while the rest of the city slept. He knew every corner, every elevator sound, every security camera that blinked red in the dark. He knew which conference rooms stayed lit late because executives forgot to turn off the lights and which offices smelled faintly of expensive cologne even after midnight. It was honest work, quiet work, and it barely kept the lights on at home. Ethan was 38 years old, tall but slightly stooped, as if years of carrying invisible weight had curved his shoulders forward. His hands were rough, knuckles scarred, nails permanently stained no matter how often he scrubbed them. His face carried the kind of tired that sleep never fully fixed, the exhaustion of responsibility, not labor. Every night as he worked, his mind drifted back to the small apartment 10 miles away. To Noah. Noah was 9 years old and too mature for his age. The kind of kid who said, "It's okay, Dad," even when it clearly wasn't. The kind who learned early how to sit still in emergency rooms, how to breathe through a nebulizer, how to pretend the wheezing didn't scare him. 2 months earlier, Noah had been rushed to the hospital in the middle of the night, his small chest fighting for air. Ethan still remembered the way the monitors beeped, the way his own heart seemed to pound louder than the machines. The hospital bill arrived 3 weeks later. Ethan hadn't opened it right away. He'd set it on the kitchen counter, face down, like it might explode if he looked too closely. But numbers had a way of demanding attention, and when he finally did open it, the amount felt unreal, cold, final, merciless. He folded the bill carefully and placed it back on the counter. Then he picked up his keys and went to work. Tonight was no different from any other, until it was. Ethan emptied a trash bin near the employee bulletin board, the paper crinkling loudly in the silence. As he turned to leave, something caught his eye. A single sheet of white paper, taped slightly crooked. Now hiring front desk support. He froze. Ethan stepped closer, reading every line slowly, twice, as if the words might disappear if he blinked. Daytime hours, full benefits, health insurance. The salary number sat there, bold and unashamed, more than double what he made now. For a moment, the building felt smaller, the air felt heavier. His heart began to race, not with excitement, but with fear. He hadn't allowed himself to hope in a long time. He knew that building better than most of the people who worked in it. He had cleaned every executive office, every conference room where million-dollar decisions were made. He understood how the place functioned, how people moved, how problems were quietly solved before anyone noticed them. Before life fell apart, Ethan had spent 8 years working at a downtown hotel. He'd handled angry guests, lost reservations, overbooked weekends, corporate complaints. He knew how to stay calm under pressure, how to speak clearly, how to represent a place with professionalism. That experience had to count for something, didn't it? He pulled out his phone and took a picture of the flyer, his hands slightly unsteady. Then he stood there longer than he should have, mop resting against his hip, staring at the paper as if it were a doorway he was afraid to walk through. By the time his shift ended at 6 in the morning, the sky outside was turning pale gray. Ethan rode the bus home in silence, watching the city wake up. Coffee shops opening, joggers passing by, parents walking kids to school. When he reached the apartment, Noah was already at the table, eating cereal with careful, measured bites. "Morning, Dad," Noah said, smiling around a spoonful. "Morning, buddy." Ethan didn't mention the flyer. He didn't want to plant hope too early. After Noah left for school, Ethan sat at the kitchen table and opened his old laptop. It took him nearly 2 hours to write the cover letter. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because he was afraid to say it wrong. He didn't exaggerate, he didn't lie. He simply told the truth. When he clicked submit, he closed the laptop immediately, as if the decision might undo itself if he waited too long. 3 days later, his phone buzzed while he was sitting in the same chair. Interview invitation. Ethan read the email 3 times before it sank in. For the first time in years, something inside him stirred. Not joy, hope. And hope, he knew, was the most dangerous thing of all. Ethan didn't tell Noah about the interview right away. He carried the email with him for the rest of the day like a fragile secret, afraid that saying it out loud might somehow make it disappear. Hope had burned him before. He had learned to handle it carefully, the way you handle something sharp. That evening, as Noah sat on the couch doing homework, Ethan finally mentioned it. "There's a job interview next Tuesday," he said casually, leaning against the kitchen counter. Noah looked up, his pencil paused mid-sentence. "Like, a better job?" Ethan nodded. "Daytime, front desk." Noah didn't cheer. He didn't jump up. He just smiled. A slow, careful smile. "That's good, Dad." That was enough. The next few days passed in a quiet blur. Ethan borrowed a suit from his neighbor, a retired salesman who lived down the hall. The jacket was a little too big in the shoulders, the sleeves slightly long, but it was clean and pressed. Ethan ironed it himself, standing in the narrow hallway, smoothing out every crease like it mattered. Because it did. The night before the interview, Ethan barely slept. He lay in bed listening to the city outside, rehearsing answers in his head. He practiced in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie, straightening his posture, reminding himself how to smile without looking desperate. On Tuesday morning, he dropped Noah off at school early. They stood for a moment on the sidewalk, the air cool and sharp. "Good luck," Noah said quietly. Ethan swallowed. "I'll see you after." Downtown looked different in daylight. The same building he cleaned every night now buzzed with movement. People in business clothes, coffee cups in hand, conversations overlapping in confident voices. Ethan arrived 30 minutes early and sat in the lobby, his hands folded tightly in his lap. He watched people walk past him without seeing him. At 10 o'clock sharp, his name was called. The elevator ride to the 15th floor felt longer than usual. When the doors opened, Ethan stepped into a bright, glass-walled hallway that smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and money. A receptionist smiled politely and asked him to wait. The conference room was cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. 3 people sat across from him at a long glass table. The man in the center introduced himself as the head of HR. The others nodded, professional and distant. Ethan sat up straight, shoulders squared, reminding himself that he belonged here, at least for now. The first questions were easy. They asked about his time at the hotel, about handling difficult guests, about conflict resolution. Ethan answered calmly, confidently. He spoke about patience, about listening, about solving problems before they escalated. He noticed the operations manager nodding along. For a brief moment, something inside him relaxed. Then the tone shifted. "Where did you attend college?" Well, the HR manager asked, glancing down at Ethan's resume. "I didn't," Ethan said evenly. "I went straight to work after high school." A note was written. A glance was exchanged. "And your current position?" another voice asked. Ethan hesitated for half a second, just long enough to feel the weight of the room. "I work nights," he said, "as a janitor here, in this building." Something changed. It wasn't dramatic. No one frowned. No one spoke sharply. But the air felt different, thinner somehow. The questions that followed weren't about experience anymore. They were about image, about fit, about whether he could represent the company. Ethan felt his chest tighten, but his voice stayed steady. He answered honestly. He didn't defend himself. He didn't apologize for his life. When the HR manager finally said, "We'll be in touch," Ethan knew what it meant. He stood, thanked them for their time, and walked out. In the elevator, he stared at his reflection in the mirrored walls. He looked older than he felt, tired but not broken. As he crossed the lobby toward the exit, sunlight poured through the glass doors. He told himself he had done the right thing. He hadn't begged. He hadn't shrunk himself. That had to count for something. He reached for the door handle, and then he heard his name. "Ethan Walker, please wait." The voice echoed across the lobby, clear and urgent. Ethan's hand froze on the door handle. For a split second, he thought he'd imagined it, that maybe hope was playing tricks on him again, the way it sometimes did when you were already tired and disappointed. He turned slowly. A woman stood near the security desk, breathing slightly hard, as if she'd hurried to get there. She wore a dark, tailored suit that looked expensive without trying to show it. Her posture was straight, her presence unmistakable. People nearby had stopped walking. their conversations trailing off. Ethan didn't recognize her at first. Then he saw the badge clipped neatly to her jacket. Claire Montgomery, the CEO. The realization hit him like cold water. He had seen her photo in company emails, on framed plaques near the elevators. But never like this. Never up close. Never calling his name. "Sir," she said again, softer now, "could you step back inside for a moment?" Ethan hesitated. Every instinct told him to leave. He had already accepted the rejection. Turning back felt dangerous, like reopening a wound he'd just managed to close. But something in her tone wasn't dismissive. It wasn't polite. It was intent. He let the door swing shut behind him. They moved to a quieter corner of the lobby, away from the flow of employees and the watchful eyes of security. Claire looked at him for a long moment, studying his face as if matching it to a memory. "I watched your interview," she said finally. Ethan felt his shoulders tense. "I understand if—" "I watched all of it," she repeated, start to finish. The words settled heavily between them. She explained calmly that she'd been reviewing hiring practices across the company, sitting in remotely on interviews as part of a broader culture assessment. Ethan listened, nodding, unsure where this was going. Then she said something that made his breath catch. "2 months ago, an older woman nearly collapsed right here in this lobby," Claire said. "She's one of our most important partners." Ethan's mind raced back to that night. The dizziness, the way the woman's hands had trembled, the candy he always carried in his pocket for Noah. "That was you," Claire said. "You recognized what was happening before anyone else did." Ethan swallowed. "I just helped." Claire nodded. "She remembered you. She mentioned you by name." For a moment, Ethan didn't know what to feel. Gratitude made him uncomfortable. Praise even more so. He hadn't helped that woman to be seen. He'd helped because it was the right thing to do. Claire's expression hardened slightly. "What I saw in that interview today didn't sit right with me." Ethan looked away, his jaw tightening. "They didn't think I was a good fit." "That's not what I saw," she said. He met her eyes again, something cautious and wounded flickering there. "Are you offering me the job because of that night?" "No," Claire said immediately. "I don't believe in charity, and I don't believe in shortcuts." That answer surprised him. "What I believe in," she continued, "is accountability. And I just watched my company dismiss a capable candidate based on assumptions instead of facts." Ethan took a step back. "I don't want special treatment." Claire didn't flinch. "Then don't accept it. But don't confuse fairness with favoritism." Before he could respond, she pulled out her phone and made a brief call. Her voice was calm, controlled, unmistakably authoritative. "I need the interview panel in the lobby," she said. "Now." She ended the call and looked back at Ethan. "You don't have to stay," she said quietly. "You can walk out, and I won't stop you." The lobby felt suddenly too open, too exposed. Ethan thought of Noah, of the hospital bill still sitting on the counter, of the way the interview room had gone silent when he said the word janitor. If he walked away now, nothing would change. "I'll stay, he said. 5 minutes later, the elevator doors opened, and the people who had dismissed him stepped out, unaware that everything was about to shift. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. Marcus stepped out first, followed by the assistant and the operations manager. They looked confused, their expressions still set in the neutral masks of people who believed their workday was proceeding as planned. Then they noticed Claire standing near the center of the lobby. And Ethan. Marcus slowed. His eyes flicked briefly to Ethan, then back to Claire. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his tone careful. "Yes," Claire said. Her voice wasn't raised, but it carried. "There is." The lobby felt suddenly smaller. Conversations nearby faded. Even the security guard straightened, sensing the shift. Claire gestured lightly toward Ethan. "I reviewed the interview you conducted with Mr. Walker this morning," she said. "I'd like you to explain the decision to reject him." Marcus cleared his throat. "The decision was based on standard hiring criteria." "Be specific," Claire said. Marcus hesitated. "He doesn't have a college degree, and he lacks formal training for a client-facing role." Claire nodded once. "Is a degree required for the position?" "No," Marcus admitted, "but it's preferred." "Where is that stated in the job description?" Marcus didn't answer right away. The assistant glanced down at her tablet. The operations manager shifted his weight. Claire continued unhurried. "You also mentioned professional image. What does that mean?" Marcus chose his words carefully. "We need someone who reflects the company's culture." Claire looked at him steadily. "And what does our culture exclude?" The silence stretched. Ethan stood still, hands at his sides, listening. He felt exposed. every word peeling back assumptions that had never been spoken aloud. This wasn't how he imagined being defended. This wasn't quiet. This wasn't private. But it was honest. Claire turned to the operations manager. Did you review Mr. Walker's work history? Yep, the man said. He worked in hospitality years ago. For 8 years, Claire said. Managing guests, resolving conflicts, representing an establishment every day. That's different, Marcus said quickly. This is a corporate environment. How is it different? Claire asked. Marcus opened his mouth, closed it again. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. Not anger, but a strange clarity. For the first time, the judgment he'd always sensed was being named, examined, questioned. Claire turned to Ethan. Tell me about a difficult situation you handled at the hotel. Ethan hesitated, then spoke. A guest once came in furious about a booking error. He was loud. Other guests were watching. I listened. I apologized for the inconvenience, even though it wasn't my fault. I worked with the manager to fix it. He left calm. He wrote a positive review. Claire nodded. Would that skill be useful at our front desk? Yes, Marcus said quietly. Then explain the rejection, Claire said. Marcus exhaled. We made a judgment call. It was the wrong one, Claire said. The assistant spoke up, her voice tight. We followed internal standards. Then the standards are flawed, Claire replied. If they allow bias to outweigh merit, Ethan watched their faces change, defensiveness giving way to discomfort. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't planned to stand here while people unraveled their own reasoning in public, but a part of him needed to see it. Claire straightened. The decision is overturned, she said. Mr. Walker deserves a fair evaluation. Marcus stiffened. With respect, this is final, Claire said. She turned to Ethan. Would you be willing to speak with me privately about next steps? Ethan met her gaze. He could feel resentment lingering in the air, could sense that nothing about this would be easy. If he stayed, he would be visible now, for better or worse. But if he left, he'd be invisible forever. Yes, he said. Claire dismissed the panel. They returned to the elevator without another word, their reflections swallowed by the closing doors. As the lobby noise slowly returned, Ethan felt the weight of what had just happened settle over him. He hadn't won anything. But for the first time, he hadn't been dismissed either. And that felt like the beginning of something dangerous. Something real. The conference room Claire led Ethan into was smaller than the one upstairs. There were no glass walls this time. No long table meant to intimidate. Just a round desk, soft lighting, and the low hum of the building settling back into its routine. The door closed behind them with a quiet click that felt final. Claire didn't sit right away. She loosened her jacket, exhaled, then looked at Ethan with an expression that was tired but resolute. I owe you an apology, she said. Not for what happened today, but for letting a system like that exist in the first place. Ethan shifted in his chair. Praise made him uneasy. Apologies from powerful people even more so. I don't need one, he said. I just don't want to be a problem. Claire studied him. You're not. You're a mirror. That word stayed with him. She explained what she was willing and not willing to do. There would be no immediate front desk position, no announcement, no symbolic gesture that would set him up to fail or make others resent him. Instead, she offered a 2-month training program with the customer service management team. You'll be paid from day one, she said. Double what you make now. Full benefits. Health insurance for you and your son. Ethan's throat tightened. But, she continued, you'll be evaluated like everyone else. No shortcuts, no protection. He didn't answer right away. Part of him wanted to say yes immediately. The bills, Noah's medication, the constant calculation at the grocery store. But another part, the part that had stood up and walked out of that interview, held him back. I don't want to be here because someone feels bad for me, Ethan said. Claire nodded. Good, because I don't feel bad for you. I respect you. That was different. He accepted. That night, Ethan sat across from Noah at the kitchen table. The hospital bill folded neatly between them. So did you get the job? Noah asked. Not yet, Ethan said honestly, but I got a chance. Noah considered that, then smiled. That's better. The training began the following week. Ethan was the oldest in the room. The others wore confidence easily. College degrees printed beneath their names on badges. Voices quick with jargon. Ethan wore his borrowed suit again, sleeves still a little too long, hands folded carefully in front of him. The instructor, a sharp-eyed woman named Linda, wasted no time. She drilled them on communication, on tone, on de-escalation. She threw scenarios at them without warning. Angry visitors, lost credentials, executives running late. Some of the younger trainees stumbled. Ethan didn't. He recognized the patterns, the frustration beneath the anger, the need to be heard. He responded with steady words and calm posture, grounding the chaos the way he always had. Linda noticed. By the second week, the training turned technical. New systems, security protocols, software that moved faster than Ethan liked. He stayed late, practicing, writing notes by hand the way he always had. Progress came slower here, but it came. At night, he still worked his janitor shift. He cleaned the same lobby he trained to stand in during the day, pushed the same mop past the same front desk. Sometimes he caught his reflection in the glass and barely recognized the man balancing between two worlds. Exhaustion crept in. Doubt followed close behind. But every morning Noah asked how it was going. And every morning Ethan answered, "I'm still standing." By the end of the second month, the evaluation loomed. Ethan sat alone in the break room, hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee, waiting to be called. He didn't know if he'd done enough. He only knew he hadn't taken a single shortcut. When Linda finally called his name, she didn't smile. "You exceeded expectations," she said simply. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. For the first time, the future didn't feel like a gamble. It felt earned. Ethan arrived early on his first official day. The suit he wore this time wasn't borrowed. It was simple, gray, modest, nothing flashy, but it fit him perfectly. He'd bought it with his first paycheck from the training program, standing in the department store fitting room longer than necessary, staring at his reflection like he was trying to recognize the man looking back. The lobby looked different in the morning. Sunlight spilled through the glass walls, stretching across the marble floor he had cleaned for years in silence. Employees streamed in with coffee cups and distracted conversations, moving past him without noticing. At least at first. Ethan stood behind the front desk. For a moment, he just breathed. Then the day began. Visitors arrived. IDs were checked. Directions were given. Questions came quickly, sometimes impatiently. Ethan answered each one with calm efficiency, his voice steady, his posture relaxed but attentive. When a delivery driver grew frustrated over a delay, Ethan listened, really listened, and solved the problem without raising his voice. When an elderly woman arrived too early for a meeting and looked disoriented, Ethan offered her a chair and a glass of water. "It's no trouble," he said, smiling gently. Because it wasn't. Across the desk, David, the mentor who had trained him, gave a subtle nod of approval. No words were needed. At lunchtime, Ethan sat alone at a small table in the employee cafeteria, unwrapping a sandwich he'd packed that morning. A few minutes later, two co-workers from the front desk joined him. They talked about schedules, broken printers, the strange personalities that passed through the building every day. Ethan listened more than he spoke. But he felt it, the quiet, unfamiliar sense of belonging. In the afternoon, Claire Montgomery passed through the lobby with a small group of executives. She was mid-conversation, focused, efficient. As she walked by the desk, her eyes met Ethan's. She paused for half a second and nodded. Not a congratulatory nod, not a thank you, just acknowledgement. Ethan nodded back. That was enough. At the end of the day, Ethan clocked out and stepped back into the city. The evening air was warm, carrying the sound of traffic and distant laughter. He felt tired, but it was a clean kind of tired, the kind that comes from work that matters. At the bus stop, he pulled out his phone and typed a message to Noah. "On my way home, today was good." A moment later, the reply came back. "Did you win, Dad?" Ethan smiled and typed slowly. "No, but I didn't give up." When he got home, Noah was waiting at the table, homework finished, inhaler nearby but untouched. Ethan sat across from him, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "You look different," Noah said finally. Ethan laughed softly. "Do I?" "Yeah," Noah said. "Like you're not tired in the same way." Ethan thought about that later, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. For years, he had been invisible. Not because he lacked value, but because no one had bothered to look closely enough. The world had judged him by his job title, his clothes, his silence. But character had been there all along, quiet, unshakable. Degrees could open doors, but dignity decided who deserved to walk through them. Ethan closed his eyes, knowing tomorrow he'd return to the same lobby. Not as the man who cleaned it after midnight, but as the man who greeted it in the light. And maybe that was the real victory. A question for you. Have you ever felt invisible, judged not by who you are, but by where you were standing in life. What would you do if you were finally given a fair chance? If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. More emotional, human stories are coming, and your support helps them reach others who need to hear them.